Americans eat more turkey than almost anyone else on the planet, and yet almost none of you have ever eaten a turkey egg. Turkey shows up on the table every Thanksgiving, on deli counters, on fast food menus everywhere, but the egg the same bird actually lays is functionally invisible in ordinary life. That absence barely registers as strange, because the word egg has already been assigned, permanently, to one particular bird before most of you were even old enough to ask why. In most American kitchens, egg means chicken egg the same specific way that soda, in most of the country, means one particular carbonated drink out of an entire category of options. But here is the actual question nobody asks. Turkeys lay eggs, ducks lay eggs. Geese, quail, and dozens of other domesticated birds lay eggs, every single one of them edible. So why does one specific bird supply nearly the entire global egg market, while an animal raised for meat right alongside it never got assigned that same role? And the deeper, more useful question is not why chicken won. It is what specific, documented decisions, some genetic, some legal, some economic, had to happen before that outcome became locked into place. Answering that honestly means moving well past the usual explanation people reach for, that chicken eggs simply taste better or cook more easily, because neither claim survives much scrutiny once you look at how other eggs actually perform in kitchens where they are used every day. It means going back roughly 1100 years to a single genetic accident, forward through a set of medieval religious calendars nobody associates with grocery shopping today, and into a federal regulation most people have never read a single line of, each one quietly adding another layer of advantage to the same bird. If tracing exactly how something this ordinary got built, decision by decision, is the kind of investigation you enjoy, subscribing means you will not miss the next one. Start with the biology, because the real explanation is far more specific than chickens were bred for a long time, and the specificity matters. Almost every wild bird species times its reproduction to the length of daylight, a mechanism controlled through a hormonal pathway involving a gene called the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor, or TSHR. Under normal photoperiod signaling, a bird's body reads shortening or lengthening daylight and switches reproduction on and off accordingly. Which is why most wild birds, and most domesticated birds besides chickens, still lay in a defined seasonal window rather than year-round. Researchers studying the genetic differences between modern domestic chickens and their wild ancestor, the red jungle fowl, identified a specific mutation in that same TSHR gene, one associated with a reduced response to seasonal daylight cues and a notably faster onset of egg laying at sexual maturity. Genetic dating techniques applied to historical and modern samples place strong selection for this specific variant, beginning roughly 1100 years ago, a timeline that lines up closely with archaeological and documentary evidence of a real jump in chicken and egg consumption across Europe around that same period. That is a strikingly different story than humans slowly bred better egg layers over vague centuries. It is a specific mutation in a specific gene spreading through a specific population on a timeline researchers can actually date, and it is the single biological event most responsible for chickens being willing to lay eggs almost every day of the year instead of during one narrow seasonal window, like the vast majority of other birds. Laboratory work comparing birds carrying the ancestral version of the gene against birds carrying the derived domestic version found measurable differences beyond just laying speed, including changes in brain gene expression tied to that same hormonal pathway and reduced aggression toward other birds, suggesting this single mutation reshaped more of the bird's basic temperament and physiology than the egg-laying calendar alone. Turkeys are the clearest possible demonstration of what happens without that particular genetic shortcut, and they are worth sitting with for a moment because they were domesticated for food just as thoroughly as chickens were. A turkey hen typically lays at most a couple of eggs a week, nothing close to a daily rhythm, and does not even begin laying until she is around 7 months old, considerably later than a hen reaches point of lay. Turkeys also remain far more strongly seasonal breeders than chickens, with reproductive activity concentrated heavily in spring regardless of how they are managed. Raising a turkey specifically for its eggs, under those constraints, costs a farmer roughly the same amount of space and feed as raising a chicken, while returning a small fraction of the eggs. The blunt economic reality quoted by people who actually raise turkeys commercially is that a turkey is worth more dead, sold whole for its meat, than it is alive and slowly producing a low volume of eggs across a narrow season. Chickens escaped that exact trap the moment the TSHR mutation spread widely enough to make daily, year-round laying the norm rather than the exception. Turkeys never did. Two birds, domesticated by the same broad human process, arrived at completely different economic roles. Not because one species was somehow chosen by culture and the other rejected, but because one of them carries a specific genetic change the other one does not. It is worth noting that this is not simply a story about wild versus tame. Both birds are thoroughly domesticated, raised on the same kinds of farms, fed the same general categories of feed, slaughtered through the same broad commercial infrastructure. The difference sits entirely inside their reproductive biology, in whether or not a single hormonal pathway still listens to the length of the day, and that difference alone was enough to send one bird toward the egg carton and the other almost entirely toward the roasting pan. Biology alone, though, does not fully explain why duck, goose, and other eggs remain rare, specifically in American grocery stores today, because plenty of countries eat those eggs regularly at real commercial scale. Part of the answer sitting underneath the American picture specifically is regulatory, not biological at all. The federal rule written to prevent salmonella contamination in shell eggs, found in the Code of Federal Regulations under the Food Safety Framework governing shell egg production, storage, and transportation, defines the shell egg it covers as, specifically, the egg of the domesticated chicken. A broader federal law, the Egg Products Inspection Act, does technically extend oversight to eggs from turkeys, ducks, geese, and guinea fowl as well. But the specific, detailed salmonella prevention testing and handling requirements that most large retailers now expect as a baseline before stocking a shell egg were written narrowly around chicken eggs alone. That leaves duck, goose, and other poultry eggs sitting in a genuine regulatory gray area in the United States, without the same clearly defined, retailer-friendly federal safety pathway chicken eggs have, which raises the practical cost and legal uncertainty of scaling them up for a mainstream American supermarket shelf. A national grocery chain deciding whether to stock a new product generally wants a single, well-established federal standard it can point to when a customer or an inspector asks how safety is being verified. Chicken eggs offer exactly that. Duck and goose eggs, at national retail scale, currently do not, which pushes them toward specialty channels almost by default, independent of how any of them actually taste. None of that is true nutritional science, and none of it is ancient instinct. It is a specific administrative choice, made when that rule was written, about which single species the rule would formally define as the shell egg. That same regulation, though, contains its own small crack, and it is worth pausing on because it shows the rule was never quite as absolute as it first sounds. Producers with a small enough flock, generally cited around fewer than 3,000 laying hens, who sell their eggs directly to consumers rather than through a large retail distribution chain, are exempt from the strictest parts of the federal shell egg testing requirements altogether. That specific carve-out is exactly why duck eggs, goose eggs, and other alternative eggs still show up regularly at farmers markets, small specialty grocers, and directly from small farms across the country, even while remaining almost entirely absent from a major national supermarket chain, sold instead in small batches, often at a noticeably higher price per egg than the chicken carton sitting a few stalls away. The barrier was never that Americans cannot legally sell or eat a duck egg. It is that scaling a duck egg operation up to supermarket distribution size means leaving that small producer exemption behind and running directly into a regulatory framework that was written with only one bird explicitly in mind. Small-scale duck egg farming has genuinely grown in recent years precisely inside that exemption, which tells you the demand is not entirely absent. It simply has nowhere obvious to go once it outgrows a farmer's market stand, since the next step up in scale means confronting the same narrowly written federal rule this whole section has been describing. That regulatory detail changes how the entire earlier part of this investigation should be read. A specific genetic mutation from roughly 1100 years ago gave one species a head start at laying constantly instead of seasonally. A specific, narrowly worded modern food safety rule then formalized that same species by name as the legal definition of what a shell egg even is. Put those two facts together, one from deep biology and one from recent administrative law, and chicken's dominance stops looking like the natural, inevitable outcome of which egg simply tastes best or suits a human diet most efficiently. It starts looking like two separate traceable decisions, one biological and ancient, one bureaucratic and recent, that reinforced each other, until an alternative would need to overcome both a missing gene and a missing legal category, just to compete on an equal footing. The idea that a bird's eggs could function as a form of formal, trackable value is not a modern invention either, and looking backward actually strengthens the case that chicken's role was administrative, long before it was industrial. Manorial records from medieval England show tenant farmers owing their landlords specific itemized quantities of eggs as part of their formal rent obligations, alongside hens, at fixed calendar points such as Easter, on top of whatever cash or labor rent was also owed. Historians studying these manorial accounts have noted that, by comparison with cash payments, small in-kind renders like eggs had become a relatively minor part of the overall economy by the late medieval period, yet local clergy collecting tithes still found themselves stuck, handling these small, perishable, difficult-to-value goods, eggs specifically among them, because they were awkward to convert cleanly into standardized income. Long before anyone had identified a gene or written a federal food safety code, the chicken egg already occupied a specific, documented administrative role, a small but formally counted unit of obligation between tenant, landlord, and church. That is not proof the taboo around other eggs is ancient. It is proof that the chicken egg specifically had already been absorbed into formal record-keeping systems centuries before industrial agriculture existed, giving it an institutional head start that duck, goose, and turkey eggs simply never accumulated in quite the same documented way. That same medieval church calendar also produced the single clearest cultural proof of what the TSHR mutation had actually done to chickens, even though nobody at the time understood it in genetic terms at all. Medieval Christian practice, laid out explicitly by theologians, including Thomas Aquinas, forbade eggs, along with meat and dairy, throughout the roughly 40 days of Lent leading up to Easter. Geese, ducks, and most other domesticated birds would naturally have slowed or paused their own egg-laying heading into the colder, darker stretch of the year, regardless of any religious calendar, because their reproduction was still governed by the seasonal daylight signal chickens had genetically escaped. Chickens kept laying anyway, Lent or no Lent, producing a backlog of perfectly good eggs that households were formally forbidden from eating until the fast ended. That is the actual, documented origin of the Easter egg as a cultural object, a genuine surplus of unusually persistent chicken eggs, hard-boiled or otherwise preserved to survive the fast, then blessed, decorated, and eaten in a burst once Lent lifted. No other common domesticated bird would have generated that same predictable, recurring surplus on that same religious timetable, because no other common domesticated bird had broken free of the seasonal laying pattern in the same way. A tradition most people now associate with painted plastic shells and chocolate began as a direct, physical consequence of one species' genetics colliding with one religious calendar, and it quietly reinforced, year after year, which specific egg belonged at the center of European food culture. The same logic that separated chicken from every other bird eventually turned inward and split the chicken itself in two, which is a detail almost nobody outside the poultry industry ever encounters. Once chicken had already secured its genetic and legal head start, breeders spent the 20th century optimizing two entirely separate versions of the same species for two entirely separate jobs. One lineage, developed for lean, efficient, near-constant laying, produced the slender, high-output hens that supply nearly every carton of eggs sold in an American grocery store. A completely different lineage was bred for the opposite priority: rapid muscle growth and body weight, producing the broad-chested birds raised specifically for meat and slaughtered long before they would ever lay a meaningful number of eggs at all. These are not simply two uses for one generic bird. They are two increasingly specialized branches of artificial selection, run in parallel for the better part of a century, each one optimized so heavily for its own single purpose that a modern egg-laying hen and a modern meat chicken are, in practical terms, considerably more different from each other than a modern layer. Hen is from many of the wild birds. This video has already discussed. The industrial logic that first separated chicken from duck, goose, and turkey did not stop there. It kept subdividing, right down to the level of two different versions of the exact same species, each engineered around a single narrow economic purpose. All of that institutional momentum, though, created a vulnerability that becomes very easy to see once you look at what actually happened to the American egg supply only a few years ago. Beginning in early 2022, a highly pathogenic strain of avian influenza tore through commercial laying flocks across the United States. According to data tracked by the Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, more than 43 million egg-laying hens were lost that year alone, either to the disease itself or to the depopulation required to contain it, arriving in two separate waves across the year. By the final weeks of December of that year, national egg inventories were running roughly 29% below where they had started, and the average retail price of a dozen eggs climbed from about $2.17 in January to roughly $5.10 a year later, with weekly prices briefly touching $5.37 at the very peak of the shortage. The shortage got severe enough that federal regulators temporarily approved emergency imports of liquid egg product from several other countries, including the nation of Turkey, entirely unrelated to the bird of the same name, along with South Korea, simply to help cover the gap left by tens of millions of dead hens. Customs officials also reported a sharp jump, in some measures more than doubling year over year, in individual travelers attempting to carry raw shell eggs across the southern border from Mexico, where the outbreak had been far less severe, because ordinary people were willing to risk a customs violation over a carton of eggs. Prices did eventually fall back sharply through the following year as flocks recovered, but the underlying vulnerability that produced that spike and that border traffic in the first place has not gone anywhere. When an entire national food supply runs through a single species, concentrated in large facilities, a disease that targets that one species efficiently becomes a disease that can move retail prices across the entire country within months. A food system built on genuine diversity, spread across several bird species with staggered breeding seasons and separate disease exposures, would not have been anywhere near as exposed to a single viral strain moving through a single kind of bird. Ducks, geese, and turkeys can carry their own strains of avian influenza as well, but a supply chain that actually depended on several different species in meaningful volume would not have watched its entire retail egg price more than double because of an outbreak concentrated so heavily in one. What remains genuinely uncertain, and worth stating plainly rather than glossing over, is how much of today's overwhelming preference for chicken eggs reflects a real, freely chosen culinary judgment about taste and usefulness versus how much simply reflects a supply chain and a legal framework that were built around chicken so thoroughly, so early, that competing eggs never received a fair commercial test in the American market at all. Researchers studying the TSHR mutation can date roughly when it spread and describe its physiological effect with real precision, but they cannot fully reconstruct every social and economic pressure in early medieval Europe that pushed people to select so intensely for that one trait in that one species rather than in ducks or geese living in the same farmyards. That is a limitation of the historical record, not a gap this video can responsibly paper over with a tidy guess. It is also worth being honest that correlation is doing real work in that part of the story. The timing of strong TSHR selection, lining up with documented growth in European chicken consumption around the same general period, is a genuine, published finding, but a single overlapping timeline is not the same thing as a fully reconstructed causal chain connecting a specific royal decree, a specific monastery, or a specific market town directly to that exact genetic shift. Historians and geneticists working on this question are, by their own account, still reconstructing exactly how tightly those threads connect. Put the whole picture together, and a very different explanation emerges than the one most people assume without ever examining it. Chicken eggs did not simply win some open, ongoing contest against every other kind of egg on flavor, nutrition, or convenience. One species carried a specific genetic mutation that broke the seasonal reproductive clock nearly every other bird still runs on. That same species had already been folded into formal rent and tithe records centuries before industrial farming existed. And in the modern United States specifically, federal food safety law then defined the shell egg, by name, as the egg of that one domesticated bird, leaving every other egg to compete without the same clearly marked legal path to a supermarket shelf. None of that required anyone to decide duck eggs or turkey eggs or goose eggs were inferior. It only required one species to clear a genetic hurdle first, and a set of institutions, first manorial, later religious, later federal, to keep building around that same head start ever since. Even the turkey, a bird Americans have been just as willing to farm, kill, and eat in enormous numbers, never got the equivalent break, which is exactly why it makes such a clean control case. Turkey proves the missing ingredient was never a lack of human willingness to domesticate and industrialize a bird. It was the specific absence of one genetic shortcut that chickens happened to carry and turkeys never did. So the next time you crack a chicken egg into a pan without a second thought, that absence of thought is not really about biology, and it is not really about taste. It is the end result of a mutation dated to roughly 1100 years ago, a set of medieval rent ledgers, and a federal rule that legally defined an entire food category around a single bird, all quietly working together long before you ever had the chance to compare. If a virus can still empty a grocery shelf of a food this basic within a matter of months, how confident are you, really, that this arrangement is the safest one available, rather than simply the one that happened to arrive first? Tell me which part of this surprised you most, the gene, the ledger, or the law, and I will see you in the next investigation.